You're listening to Big World Network.
The Revolt of the Sorcerers, The Loremaster's Expedition, Episode 1, written by Daniel Mitchell, read by Amanda Mavison. Shuffling along the hallways of the church at a leisurely pace, Garadain smiled and nodded to the occasional cleric or church knight that would greet him. Dressed in his faded blue robes, he leaned heavily upon his staff, the rounded end clacking against the stone as he made his way toward the record hall. Upon reaching the expansive archive where the church kept its texts and tomes, the familiar smell of ink and old paper mingled together greeted him. Garadain smiled and took a deep breath of contentment. Crossing over to his desk, it was then that he spotted the scroll sitting neatly on top of a stack of books. Loremaster, written on the front in a flowing penmanship that Garadain knew could only be produced by the university scribes. Sighing, he released his staff, the branch standing straight up, as if it were still being held, and waiting for him next to his desk. Lowering himself into his chair, the Loremaster grunted, settling in and adjusting to get comfortable. "Garadain, you're getting old," he muttered to himself, positioning a feather cushion behind his back for added support. Taking out his long-stemmed pipe and a brown leather pouch full of his favorite pipeweed, Garadain continued to eye the envelope as he packed his bowl, returning the pouch to one of the hidden pockets within his robe. Lighting a splint off a candle, he drew in several deep pulls as he took the flame to his pipe, extinguishing the splint by waving it out while continuing to stoke his pipe to life. "All right now, let's see what Elwyn wants this time," he said aloud, taking the scroll in his left hand and turning it over. On the back, the seal of the Archmage was pressed into a blotch of red wax, a red satin ribbon holding the scroll together. Taking the stem of his pipe in his teeth, Garadain untied the ribbon, carefully broke the waxen seal, and unrolled the scroll, spreading it out on the desk before him. Once he'd read the letter, Garadain frowned, staring at the words that were written on it as he contemplated the message they bore. For several long minutes, the Loremaster sat in silence, mulling over what had been presented to him, and what had been asked of him, reading over the letter several more times. Finally, with a sigh, Garadain rolled the parchment back up, ponderously retying the red ribbon around it. Tucking it up his left sleeve, Garadain pushed himself up from his chair with a muffled groan, retrieving the wide-brimmed pointed hat that sat atop the head of a decorative marble bust standing nearby. Unceremoniously donning the hat, the Loremaster reached for his staff. It came to his hand when called, a trail of smoke clouds following him as his staff clacked along the stone floors again. "Thank you, cleric," Garadain said, stepping through the large wooden doors as the elderly cleric Harros pushed them open and held them for him. Shaking his head, Harros smiled his warm, welcoming smile. "You're quite welcome, Loremaster. Will you be out on your errand for long?" Without looking back, Garadain continued to make his way down the front steps that led down the street. "Not if things go the way I hope," he replied. Harrow squinted slightly in confusion, but still smiled amiably as the Loremaster turned right and made his way along the road. It was still early, the sun had only just begun to rise, yet the city of Ascension was bustling with activity. Merchants steered ox-drawn carts laden heavy with their wares toward the market square in the center of town. People coursed through the main roads and side alleys as they went about their daily lives, and children ran about freely at play. Making his way along the northern road that went past the palace, Garadain looked on the busy lives of the city's people and smiled, sighing contentedly. A little girl, followed closely by a large, short-haired dog with pointed ears that was easily twice her size, came running up to him. He stopped, looking down at the girl as she tugged on the front of his robe and spoke to him in the curious tone of an innocent child. "What's that stick for?" Chuckling, Garadain tilted his head, reaching down and letting the black and brown dog sniff his hand, waiting until it began to lick at his palm before scratching behind its ears. The dog opened its mouth to pant and let its tongue hang out. "It helps me walk, little one." Contemplating his answer for only a brief moment, the little girl tilted her head, placing a hand on the back of the dog's neck as she spoke again, her tone shifting to indicate that she realized she wasn't being told the entire truth. "How come you're dressed like that? Are you a wizard?" His smile widening, Garadain laughed, patting the dog on the head a few times. "What makes you think I'm a wizard?" Rolling her eyes impatiently, the girl pointed at his staff as she replied, "Because your stick has wizard letters on it, and you're wearing one of their hats." Garadain raised his eyebrows, nodding approvingly. "That's very clever of you to have noticed. I was a wizard once, a long time ago." Her eyes going wide, the little girl smiled brightly. "Can you show me a magic trick?" As if in agreement, the dog sat down patiently, barking happily. Furrowing his brow in concentration for a moment, Garadain reached into one of his pockets and produced a silver piece, holding it out for the girl to inspect. Then taking it between his palms and flattening out his hands, with a simple twist and flourish of his fingers, a small silver-colored bird appeared in the palm of his hand, chirping and tweeting loudly, much to the delight of the little girl. "Hold out your finger," Garadain said, the little girl's eyes going wide in anticipation. Following his instructions, she reached out with her finger, holding it steady as Garadain moved his hands over to her. With a short hop, the silver bird flittered over to her finger, singing cheerfully at her. Smiling from ear to ear, when she looked back up to Garadain, he motioned toward the sky with an upward nod of his head, upon which the little girl lifted her finger up abruptly, urging the bird to take flight. Immediately spreading its wings, the bird took off into the air, turning back into a coin once it was a few feet above the girl's head. Catching it as it fell, the girl inspected the coin carefully. Garadain reached out and gently tousled her hair as he spoke. "Keep it." The little girl looked up in awe. "Thank you," she said excitedly, before scurrying off, the black and brown dog following right behind her and barking playfully. Garadain watched her run off for a bit, before turning back around, continuing on down the street. Stepping up to the set of black steel gates set in the high stone walls that surrounded the arcane university, Garadain approached the crest in the middle. A pentacle surrounded by a circle with symbols at each point of the star, each one representing a different school of magic. The almond-shaped eye of mysticism, the tongue of flame for evocation, the entwined pair of twin snakes for illusion, the broken sword for transmutation, and the interlaced triquetrus circle of enchantment. "And a tree sprouting from a skull for necromancy," Garadain thought, reaching up to tap on the circular crest with the top of his staff. "But we don't discuss such matters any more." Reacting to his staff, the gates swung open to grant Garadain entry, and closed behind him as he stepped into the university courtyard. Before him stood a large building built from mortared stone, a spiral tower rising up from the slanted rooftops toward the back. Connected to the main building, but still distinctly separate, were two other buildings. Garadain knew the one on the left to be the university library. Nearly as large as the main building itself, the vast collection of written knowledge held within its walls dwarfed that of the church, and on a few rare occasions Garadain had made use of the almost limitless resources one could find when the church's archives proved inadequate. Off to the right, the smallest of the three buildings Garadain knew to be the dormitory, the basement of which contained several large common rooms where students could study, smoke, or simply sit and enjoy each other's company. It was the main building that Garadain approached, however, stepping up to the antique-looking wooden doors and pushing through them. Walking along marble floors, Garadain admired the ivory statues of former archmages that lined the entry hall, each one sternly gazing down upon any who entered the university doors. As the hall opened out into an enormous lobby, a bored-looking mage with his head leaning in his right hand could be seen seated behind a large desk, lazily leafing through a book that sat in front of him. Without looking up, the mage addressed Garadain as he continued to read. "Enrollment forms can be found in the library." Chuckling once silently, Garadain gestured at the book that sat before the young wizard, closing his fingers and his thumb together. Immediately the book slammed shut. The young mage looked up, angrily at first, but quickly turned apologetic. "My apologies, Loremaster. I wasn't expecting you, else I'd have—" Shaking his head, Garadain held out a hand to silence him, speaking in a patient tone. "I am here to speak with Archmage Elwyn in regards to a letter he sent me. He is not expecting me, but I would speak with him at once." Nodding eagerly, the mage rose from his desk and took off at a swift walk, his apprentice robes flowing about him as he did. Smirking, Garadain looked down, swiveling the book around to read the title on the cover. The Enchanter's Handbook, a compendium of verbal and somatic components for spellcrafting. Lifting the cover, Garadain leafed through the first few pages until he found the author, squinting at the name. Adamagus Lygander. Never heard of him. For several minutes, Garadain leafed through the book, skimming over the rudimentary introductions on spellcrafting at the beginning, and browsing through the collection of verbal components used to bend the inherent arcane energy in everything to one's will. Halfway through the somatic collection, the mage returned, and Garadain looked up from the book. "Archmage Elwyn will see you, Loremaster. He says he trusts you remember how to reach his tower?" With a patronizing laugh, Garadain shook his head. "Starting up already, is he? Excellent. Thank you, apprentice. Return to your studies." With a nod, the mage took his seat at the desk again, watching as Garadain swept by. As Garadain's wooden staff rapped against the door to Archmage Elwyn's tower, Elwyn looked up from his work at the large round table he was seated at. A thin, angular man with a clean-shaven face and a full head of thin, white hair that fell down to his waist, Elwyn was tall by any standards, and viewed the world through a pair of yellow eyes that were always narrowed. Dressed in formal blue and black archmage robes, his elegant, spiraling wooden staff stood next to him, and looked unshapen, as if the smooth white wood it was made of had grown that way. "You may enter, Loremaster," Elwyn said in a terse tone of voice, each word perfectly articulated. As the door swung open, Elwyn rose from his seat, his staff meeting his hand as he reached for it. Stepping through, Garadain removed his hat and closed the door behind him, turning about and approaching the table as he spoke. "Good morning, Elwyn. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me on such short notice." His upper lip curling up as Garadain addressed him, Elwyn stood stiffly at the table and waited while Garadain crossed the enormous room, filled with various bookstands and a wide collection of magical artifacts, as well as a large wooden desk with a cushioned chair. Sitting on a perch near a window, a fluffy brown owl with grizzled eyebrows and yellow eyes shifted, watching Garadain with what seemed to be great interest. "Archmage Elwyn, if you don't mind. I did not rise to the position only to have the title swept under the rug as if it were a trifling thing. I trust there is a good reason you couldn't respond to my letter via correspondence, and saw fit to come take up a portion of my valuable time." Smiling, Garadain nodded, reaching a chair at the table and taking a seat. As he did, Elwyn sat down as well, the two of them leaving their staves to stand across from one another. Garadain sat with his right side to the table and resting his arm upon it. "Never let it be said that the Archmage of the University was unwelcoming to his guests." "Quit wasting my time, Loremaster. Why are you here?" Elwyn spat back at him, his posture as rigid as his enunciation. With a sigh, Garadain tilted his head, observing Elwyn for a long moment before answering. "I believe you already know the answer to that question." His nostrils flaring, Elwyn's eyes narrowed further. "You know as well as I do that we cannot ignore the rumors. Unless you have already completed the task I have set before you, I see no reason for you to be here." Reaching into his sleeve, Garadain produced the rolled-up parchment and laid it on the table. "What makes you so certain the University could protect the pieces any better than the defenses that already guard them? It seems to me as though the risk of retrieving them would be very much like doing most of the work for any who would attempt to claim them for their own." His frown increasing, Elwyn continued to stare icily at Garadain as he replied, "The decision has already been made, Loremaster. It is not your place to question the judgment of the Circle, or need I remind you of what happens when an Archmage forfeits their station to join the ranks of the Loremasters?" His expression growing dark, Garadain glared at Elwyn. "We are the keepers of knowledge. While the Circle mires in self-governance and sits high in their towers, we are out preserving the history of the races of the world." Elwyn let out a derisive snort. "Wandering scribes, revelling in their mindless task, you will not dissuade us from our course of action, Loremaster, and as you have seen fit to eliminate the purpose of sending a letter, I shall ask you forthright. Will you speak with the cleansing light on our behalf? His assistance in this matter would not only be a tremendous relief, but may also conceal our true intentions from those who would seek the pieces out as well, with ill intent." With an irritated sigh, Garadain stared at Elwyn for several moments, until finally he gave a consenting nod. "If the Council is wrong, and should the worst come to pass, I want you to remember this moment, Elwyn. I want you to remember that I advised you against this." Elwyn let out an indignant smirk, his tone sounding amused for the first time. "Thank you, Loremaster. That will be all."
You're listening to Big World Network.